Hi, my name is Isabel Castelao Gómez and I'm a member of the course team for Comentario de textos literarios en lengua inglesa. I welcome you to this introductory video, Elements of Poetry 2. In this video, we will have three sections. In the first one, we will see the differences between prose and poetry and the specific relation between sound and poetry. The second section will focus on metrical verse and the oral elements of this kind of poetry. And the third section will talk about the characteristic sound patterns we will find in non-metrical or free verse. What makes poetry different from prose? Prose, as we saw in the introductory video, Elements of Poetry 1, has the aim of telling the story or telling of events. Therefore, the language we use in prose is somehow more transparent than in poetry. The meaning in poetry is highlighted, or the meaning in poetic language is highlighted through visual and oral aspects of language. These visual and sound effects specific of poetic language are addressed at the reader's eye and the reader's ear. Now, poetry contains more regular beats and stresses and sound patterns, that is more musical than prose, which contains cadence. Elements of Poetry 2 will focus on the oral. It will be a very, an introduction to the basic oral aspects of poetic language. The poets use poetic techniques or sound patterns to call the attention of the reader's physical eye. Sound is deployed in the reader's physical ear. Sound deployed in the reader's mental ear happens when the poem is not read aloud. Now, the specific relation between sound and poetry relates to the origin of poetry. Before writing was developed, poetry was oral. So the sound patterns in poetry have not only aesthetic but also mnemonic functions. That is, they are devices that help aid memory. Now, we have here two quotes that are quite interesting and clarifying. Now, poetry, as well as being something that we see, is also something that we hear. There remains even now a vibrant tradition of poetry being delivered orally or recited. And even the silent reading of poetry, if properly performed, should allow the lines to register on the mind's ear. Now, if you enjoy poems, it may be because the left hemisphere of the brain translates linguistic sounds into meaning. The right hemisphere processes sound and music. The simultaneity of words and music, the simultaneous perception of linguistic and aesthetic sounds, as in song or poetry, are analyzed by both hemispheres at the same time. The cognitive dichotomies between the sensuous, semantic, or sound sense are joined in poetry. Okay. When looking for oral elements in a poem, you have to identify the sound patterns, the way sound is structured in the poem. Now, languages such as English, German, Dutch are stress time languages. It means that beats and stress are the dominant elements, and these languages tend toward regular rhythm. Otherwise, Spanish, Italian, and French are syllable-timed languages. What is metrical verse? Metrical verse is when there is a rhythmic regularity of beats and offbeats, that is, stress and unstressed syllables, an evident structure rhythm that we can quantify and measure, what we call scan. Poetry in English until the 20th century generally contains metrical verse. So most poetry you'll see in the course English Literature 1 will be metrical verse, while most of the poetry we see in this course, Comentario de textos, is contemporary poetry, therefore will be non-metrical or free verse. Let's talk now about sound patterns. Now, this is important because you will find this and you will have to be able to identify these patterns not only in metrical but in non-metrical and free verse. Now, poets manipulate sound patterns and sound effects to reinforce or enact the meaning of a poem. First one, alliteration. This is when the first sound of closely related words are the same. Generally consonants, but not always. So, for example, in bouncing balls alliterate on the letter B. Consonants, another sound pattern, is the repetition of consonantal sounds in closely related words. The last example, for example, would be alliteration because it's at the beginning of the words, and consonants because it's the consonant sound that is repeated. Now, the repetition can be also in the middle of the word, as in train and train crash, with the sound R. Assonance. Assonance is the recurrence or repetition of the same vowel sound in stressed syllable. In a stressed syllables, as in the example, a traitor to the nation, and the sound A. Sibilance is the predominance of the sound S. Rhyme is the repetition of lost vowel sounds and subsequent sounds in nearby words, generally at the end of the lines in the poem, but not always. Therefore, rhyme is the repetition of sounds at the end of words, as opposed to alliteration, that is at the beginning of words. Orthodox end rhymes are those rhymes that we find at the end of lines, as in, these schematic lines I put here, I, lie, night, sight. Internal rhymes are the repetition of final vowel sound and subsequent sound in the middle of lines, as in the examples dready, ready, or knocking, locking. Feminine rhymes are these rhymes generally fall on syllables that are stressed. Rhyme in general falls on syllables that are stressed. When the rhyme falls on stressed syllables, they're called feminine rhymes, as in quickly and slowly, where the rhyme is in the last E, which is not stressed. Pararhyme is the sequence of consonant, vowel, consonant, as in the example, scaped, scooped, or whole, hell. Free rhyming, it's when end rhymes do not follow any particular scheme. So we don't have a regular scansion, okay, as in, where's the mouse? As in the examples you have there. Now, excuse me, meter. Meter is the stress-unstressed pattern repeated in the lines of a poem. The regularity can be graphically marked through what we call scansion. Generally, we use a slash to mark the stressed syllables and an X or a dash to mark unstressed syllables. Metrics and prosody study the oral elements of metrical verse. What is the metrical unit? It's called foot, and this is the rhythmic unit that is repeated throughout the lines. They're generally disyllabic in groups of 2 syllables, or trisyllabic in group of 3 syllables. The main basic metrical forms in poetry in English is first the iambic, foot. It's a foot that starts with an unstressed syllable. The iambic pentameter, the series of 5 iambic feet, is the most popular meter in English, as in the line, "Come live with me and be my love," where the stresses are in live, me, be, love. The trochaic foot is a disyllabic foot that starts with a stress syllable, as in the line from the cartoons. Flintstones, meet the Flintstones, okay? We find the stress in the first syllable, Flynn, meet, and Flynn. Now, the dactylic meter is a trisyllabic foot, as in the nursery rhyme line, pat a cake, baker man. You see the 3 syllables. The first one in each feet is a stress. And the anapestic meter is another trisyllabic foot where the stress is in the last syllable of the group of 3 for the sky and the sea. Sorry. Okay, let's go now with non-metrical verse. To understand free verse, we have to understand the difference between meter and rhythm. Now, meter, as we saw before, and be careful because in American English is spelled differently. Meter is a regular and measurable rhythmic structure. In the 20th century, poetry in English stopped being designed on a regular basis on metrical verse, but it still contains rhythm. The rhythm of non-metrical verse or free verse is irregular and not based on the repetition of metrical feet. Now, due to the rhythmic quality of English and the use of oral elements and techniques by the poets, rhythm remains an important element in the reader's experience of free verse. We will see how this can be attained. Now, here's a quote defining rhythm. Rhythm is an alternation of strong and weak elements. The experience of rhythm is mental and bodily, a pattern of energy of tension and release that we perceive and reproduce in our brain and muscles. Okay, what is non-metrical and free verse? Well, a free verse or non-metrical verse, it's a kind of poetry that does not use traditional rhyme or metrical structures. It was practiced firstly practiced by avant-garde and the modernist movement at the beginning of the 20th century, and it went against the conventions of Romantic and Victorian poetry, which use metrical verse. Let's talk about the 20th century non-metrical free verse. Most contemporary poetry is non-metrical. However, nowadays it's particularly interesting that there is an emphasis on the oral qualities of poetry, that is, poetry readings and performances. There are 2 very interesting movements emphasizing the oral elements of poetry. One is sound poetry, which is a kind of poetry that exploits language sounds, separating it from meaning. It's, of course, experimental in itself. And there's the movement of slam poetry. It's a spoken poetry using improvisation and trying to connect with the audience and present a message, an ideological or personal message. I encourage you to look for these 2 poetic movements in the web and have a look at their kind of poetry. Now, what sound patterns and oral elements are used then in free verse? One of the most important is lineation, okay? The line in the poem is considered a unit of rhythm. Therefore, longer lines are generally read faster. Shorter lines retain orally and visually more focus of attention. They're more condensed. Longer lines tend to be more oratorical, figurative, or poetical, and attention is more on the sweep of ideas and on larger rhythmic and structures, following a kind of the rhythm of breathing somehow. Shorter lines in free verse tend to be more colloquial or imagistic, and attention is drawn to the word and short phrases. So rhythm in short lines tends to be more sharp or sharper, okay? Now, it's important to pay attention at the way lines end in free verse. End-stopped lines means it is when the line finishes with a punctuation mark or closed syntactic unit. Orally, this calls for a stop. Enjambment is when the line asks for a continuation of reading because it finishes in the middle of a sentence or a syntactic structure. Weak endings is when the line finishes in a preposition, conjunction, or unstressed monosyllables. Caesura is a marked syntactic stop in the middle of the line. And line spaces. The visual spaces in lines in free verse also demand silences or a change in rhythm. So line spaces are also worth paying attention in case of in relation to oral elements. Now, probably the most important oral element in free verse is repetition. Repetition of sounds, words, or syntactic structures. Now, repetition of sounds, you have to go and check terms such as alliteration, consonants, assonance, or rhyme. Repetition of words, in this case, we can talk about the figure of anaphora, is when the same word is repeated at the beginning of different lines. Or the repetition of syntactic structures, in this case, is a figure of parallelism. And this, repetition, I repeat, is one of the main oral techniques used in free verse. Another element will be intonation. It's especially important in free verse since it emphasizes lined ends, it emphasizes the way the poem is structured, grouping of lines. We can have stichic verse. It means that there are not stanzas in the poem. They tend to be, these kind of poems, they tend to be more narrative. We also find in stanzaic or strophic poems, it means that it is structured in groups of lines, in stanzas. And these kind of poems tend to be more lyrical in terms of intonation. Intonation marks also the tone of the poem, and it's itself an oral term, okay, tone. The poetic voice in the poem has a specific attitude towards the reader. We have to analyze this or find this through, the analysis of all the elements, oral and visual elements in the poem. Also the lexis, the diction, it is used in the poem. Now, the tone of a poem can be narrative, satirical, melancholic, meditative, colloquial, prosaic, humorous, etc. And finally, speech patterns. Far from the artificiality of meter, free verse usually bases itself in the rhythms of the colloquial, the expansion and contraction of language as it is spoken. And this, of course, includes hesitations, pauses, repetitions in the same manner as we speak in oral language. Okay, so to end this introductory video and as a way of conclusion, we have seen what makes poetry different from prose through its oral elements. Now, when you analyze a poem or fragment of a poem, remember that poetic language has specific visual and sound effects that address the reader's eye and ear. Identify the oral elements in the poem. For this, you have to read it aloud several times. I will say, how does it sound? First, identify if the poem belongs to metrical or non-metrical verse. Pay attention to its rhythm. Is it regular and measurable? Is it irregular and more natural? How does it contribute to the meaning or main message in the poem? Then analyze the sound patterns that create sound effects and appeal to your ear. That is, the poetic techniques that create sound effects. Paying attention to, lineation, the fact of having long or short lines. Pay attention to and identify repetitions of sounds at the beginning of words, at the end of words, of consonant sounds or vowel sounds, the repetition of words, or syntactic structures. Intonation. Is it a flowing intonation, more narrative or meditative, or is it a fragmented intonation? What is the poetic voice's attitude and tone of the poem? What is the poetic voice's attitude and what is the tone of the poem? Do you find speech patterns? What kind of intro line rhythm do we find? Is there any iambic or trochaic stressed units? Any repetition of feet at all? And of course, remember to ask yourself these questions for a good analysis of the poem or fragment. What techniques does the author use to highlight the aural sound effects in the poem? Are the sound patterns of the poetic language in the fragment important for the meaning of the whole poem? How do they contribute to the meaning and message of the poem? To end, some food for thought in the form of a quote. The topic of sound in poetry often raises an unresolvable theoretical controversy about the nature of poetry, namely where the poem exists, concretely on the page, that is visually, temporarily as a spoken verbal utterance, or liminally between the two. The poem exists in tension between the extremes of audible speech and silent reading. Thank you for paying attention to this video class.